Hello, welcome to Mistake Man. It's been a while since I've done an update on my build of the USS Voyager, so I figured it's time to get one of those out. As you can see, I have primed the primary hull, both the top and the bottom pieces, and I used this Duplicolor Automotive Primer Sandable, and I thought that sounded like a good way to go. I like the idea. Okay, I do want a primer that's sandable. What I didn't realize is that you have to sand this. It goes on with like a really rough, gritty texture. And oh, it was such a nightmare to have to sand this thing. I should have tested it on something first to see. I just went for it on this, and that was a huge mistake because I ended up having to sand this whole thing, and that is not easy to do. I imagine that's not too big of a deal for, an automotive surface where you've just got like nice big smooth surfaces that it's really easy to sand, but this has got all these tiny little details that I had to get in and sand. There are still some spots that you can tell where I couldn't really get into sand very well, like down in between the details on top of these raised surfaces on the bridge. You can see that, just that rough gritty texture. It's just, it was everywhere. The whole thing was just covered with that. I'm probably still going to try and do a little bit more cleanup on some of this just to try and smooth that out. But it was such a nightmare. There was so much sanding. So much intricate sanding in this that honestly, it made me kind of lose steam on this thing for a while. So I ended up just kind of working on something else for a while. I worked on my warp core build, got that finished, but now I'm back into this. I've got most of that sanding done. I'm not going to use this same primer on the rest of the model. I'm going to find something else. The reason I went with this, normally I go with the Tamiya fine surface primer, which just has a fantastic surface finish. I love it. Problem is, it comes in tiny cans, and it's like $10-11 a can, and it would probably take me 3, probably 4 of those cans to do this model. So that's at least $40 just to prime the model, and I wanted to see if I can find something that's good enough. It doesn't have to be as good of a surface finish as the Tamiya, but decent enough that it's going to do a good job without, breaking the bank. So I tried something else. This didn't work. I don't like it. It might be okay for like a 3D print thing that you want to sand, because it does tend to like fill in little like lines and stuff. But you do have to go into this knowing that you will have to sand. Not that you can sand it, but that you must. So not doing that. I'll find something else. So let me get you caught up on what I've been working on lately. As you can see, I've finished up some of the photo etching. I got this piece in. Once I got the primer on there, I did some sanding. I got a pretty decent fill on that seam line between this piece here. That was a separate little piece. As you can see, I've reinforced the original seam with some sheet styrene, and that original seam was, after some putty and some sanding, turned out pretty good. So I went ahead and finished the photo etch on that. I put this piece in, and this piece, I'm not sure why I left those off before I primed it. I don't know, I just did, but now they're in. I do need to do a little bit of work on this edge here. It's pretty good. Like, it turned out pretty good for a first pass, but there's still a little bit of a line left there. It's kind of hard to tell. Let me turn off this light. It might be easier to catch the light on. Oh, there you go. You can see there's still a little bit of a hint of a line there where I made that repair. So I'm going to have to go back in and do some more sanding and putty work on that. But yeah, it actually did turn out pretty good for a first pass. Bottom half of the primary hull looks good too after I did all that sanding. Turned out pretty good. And then I've started working on some lighting, just haven't actually got any in place yet, but I've started planning it all out, figuring out what I'm going to use, how it's all going to go together. So I did spray a coat of black spray paint on the inside of both of these to light block it. This model doesn't need a whole lot of light blocking because it's pretty thick plastic. You can see that, the hull is pretty thick there. And so a lot of light doesn't really get through, but there's just a handful of places where a little bit might ghost through. So I just did the whole black paint thing on as a first pass, and then followed it up with a coat of white, as you can see, just so that the light bounces around inside of there, just so that it's going to light all these windows as good as possible. I have not yet filled the windows in with any kind of UV resin or micro crystal clear, anything like that. I haven't decided which I'm going to use on that. I did have to put some black tulip along here where the phaser strips were, just because I gouged out the original plastic where those phaser strips were, and then put the 3D printed parts on there. And that this resin that I use, this gray resin that I print in, does not do well blocking the light. It shines through pretty well. So light was coming through those parts, so I had to block that with some black tulip. I did that before I put the spray paint coats on, obviously. When I was planning out the how many strips of LEDs I was going to need for the inside to light everything up, I wanted to make sure that I had light kind of shooting in all directions to get all these windows that are all like on different planes and facing different directions. So I was thinking I would need quite a few of them in here. However, once I put the coat of white paint on the inside, the light bounces around inside here pretty well. So let me turn off the overhead light here and the camera light. Put the two halves together, and I'll just use a flashlight to kind of shoot up inside of there. And it actually lights up really well. And this is just a single LED. Now this is one of those high power LEDs. So it's obviously putting out way more light than, just one of these, but still this gives me hope that I can actually get away with quite a few less strips of light than I thought. So yeah, that white paint really does a great job of bouncing all the light around. Okay, so I'll describe the lighting in more detail when I get to actually installing it, but I've kind of got a plan for what I'm going to do for most of it. I've also been doing some work on the rest of the model. I've got some, I did the black paint underneath and the white paint on top for my light blocking and light diffusion on this part here, because I need to light these windows in the back. Also done some work on the warp nacelles. Did the layer of black and then the layer of white on these. And I also drilled in some holes for the nav lights in the back, and then used some UV resin to create a little light dome over the top of that. I'm going to use SMDs on the inside, some tiny little LEDs that are going to be right up against that that resin to let their light out, and then light blocked, of course, so that the blue light of the warp grills doesn't come through where I don't want it to. You may have noticed I've done some other modifications to the warp nacelles. So we're going to go back in time just a little bit, and I'm going to explain what that's all about. There are definitely some inaccuracies in the warp nacelles on this kit. The overall shape is just not quite right. They're a little too straight and parallel along the sides here. They're supposed to be kind of more tapered towards the front and kind of flare out into kind of like a wide point about here, and then kind of taper towards the back a little more. there's not much I can do about that without just replacing these entirely, and I'm not really interested in doing that. Another issue is the tip is a little bit too pointy, a little too sharp. It's definitely more blunt on the filming model. Again, that's not one that I'm really interested in addressing. That's fine. There is this kind of raised feature. This is the top of the nacelle. There's this raised feature that is supposed to be here that is there on the filming model, and then it steps down to like still a raised feature, but not as raised. It goes out to the front here, and that's not quite accurate either. The original filming model has panel lines there, but they're not. It's not raised. It's flat from here all the way across up until you get to that rounded edge there. And so you can see there's supposed to be panel lines here, and then I think there's a couple that run across from side to side. I haven't decided if I'm going to try and remove that to flatten that out and then just carve in some panel lines. I think I will carve in panel lines either way, but I haven't decided if I want to try and remove that. But the biggest thing that bugs me about these is the seam, and not so much like the seam back here. That's not too bad. I mean, it's about as much as you'd have to expect to be able to clean up. But the worst part, as it always seems to be with these old Star Trek kits, is they've got the seam line running right through these grills. And there's usually not much you can do to clean those up and make that seam disappear. And it just bugs me. So I had the idea that maybe I can grind away those existing features and create a new part that I can 3D print that can replace that whole thing so that there won't be a seam there. It's just one part all the way across. So I gave it a try, and I was able to model something up. Actually, it wasn't too difficult to model, but there it is. It's got a little bit of a taper. You can see that grill feature gets narrower the farther forward you go. It kind of follows the curvature of the nacelle itself. And so I did kind of model that to match as close as I could. I made the grill features nice and sharp. They turned out to look really good. Better than I think the original here. These are a little bit kind of melty looking. Just not very sharp and crisp. So I think this ends up looking better. And I did actually grind out this feature on the other nacelle. So I ground out most of it, like almost so much that there's hardly any plastic left. I feel like it's very thin plastic there. And it started to crack away. But I left it in place just because I thought it's going to be easier to have some plastic there just to help support this part when I glue it in. I think that'll just be less hassle in the end but we'll see. So that fits in there like that, and there it is. So yeah, I think that ended up it looks so much better than it did before. So I like it. The only trick with these is that I can't put them on until I'm ready to close up the nacelles, right? I have to close up the nacelles first and then put these on last. So I'm going to have to wait to do any of that until I've got all my lighting in place and I'm ready to go. So that'll be a ways off. This is one of the warp grills for this kit, and it's not terrible, but the spacing of the lines on the grill are not quite to my liking. And so I decided to take a stab at remodeling this piece and printing it out in clear resin. So, and here it is. As you can see, the grill pattern is much finer. And here it is, put in place as a test fit. I just put a little bit of super glue to hold it in place. You can see there's a little bit of my glove that got glued in place there. And there's the hole that it came from. That's okay, this is temporary just for test fitting. So let's put the other half of the nacelle on here. And I think it fits really quite well. Except for this end up here. You can see there's a gap between the gray plastic and the 3D printed part. The original piece is rounded at the end like that, and so it does fit in there better. However, on the original model, it's just straight up and down. It's not rounded like that. And so I did decide to correct that a little bit there, and I'm going to use just some styrene to fill in that gap once the halves are assembled together. I should be able to clean that up just fine. I want to paint the grill pattern so that it's copper. So when the warp engines are unlit, they have that copper look to them like they do on the original model, like the filming model. And I've got that here. As you can see, it's got kind of a coppery look to it, but it still allows light to go through. Like that, you can see that it's still transparent. I had some ideas about how to mask this so that only the outer surface of the copper, or the outer surface of the raised lines, is painted with the copper, and the inner surface is left transparent. And as you can see, it worked here. It didn't work very well though. So what I did with this is I got some of this perfect plastic putty and watered it down a little bit just to kind of make it easier to work with. And then I just pushed it into the grooves all along here, and then used a Q-tip to clean up the outer surfaces of the grooves. So that left the plastic putty only down inside the grooves, in the depths of the grooves, and then the outer surfaces were cleared off, had no plastic putty on them. And then I used my airbrush to spray a layer of copper over it. And then the idea was to come back with, once the copper paint was dry, come back over it with water and just basically wash out the depths of the grooves to restore the look. And as you can see, it did work, kind of. I had to I used a toothbrush to just kind of get in there and clean out the grooves, and it worked okay, but in some spots I had to apply quite a bit of pressure and just really had to put some elbow into it to get the grooves to clean out, and it removed some of the paint from the outer faces where I wanted the paint to stay. And most of it's okay, but as you can see, it's not great. So that method would not be terrible. It's possible that I put too much copper paint on and it's so effectively covered over the perfect plastic putty, like it created a thick enough layer that the water couldn't really get in and dissolve the putty away. And so if I had had a lighter touch, a lighter hand with applying the paint, just a much finer coat, then it might have been easier to wash the putty away. However, the flip side of that coin is, if I had gone with just a very light coat of the paint, it might have been even easier for the brush to remove the paint. So I'm not really sure. I didn't really want to try it again unless I had to. So I haven't tried it with a thinner coat of paint just to see if that would be an effective strategy. But I do have that option to at least test it out if I can't get something else to work. Another thought that I had to mask out the grooves was to use some cardstock and just kind of shove it into the grooves to basically mask the bottoms and leave the tops available for painting. So as you can see, here, I've got some just very narrow strips of cardstock. The one drawback to this method, I haven't tried painting this yet, but I'm starting to suspect that this might not work because there's just a tiny little gap for the paint to get through, and it's got to go all the way down. I mean, these are very narrow strips of paper, but they're tall enough compared to how wide the gap is that I'm worried that the paint won't actually be able to get down in there to paint the top surface of each groove. Theoretically, I could cut the strips narrower, but then I start running into limitations of being able to handle those little pieces of paper and actually cut them consistently without them just falling apart. So that led me to think, okay, is there something else that I can put in there that's not going to be as fragile as paper, but it's still going to be narrow enough to fit down inside of those grooves? And so I started thinking about various gauges of wire that I have. And that probably came to mind because I'm also working on the lighting for the model. So I've got just kind of wires and other lighting supplies. But then I found this, which is a stranded wire, and I tested the strands on these. So here's an individual strand of that, and this is just about perfect. It takes a little bit to get it started and to fit down into one of those grooves, but then once it's started, I can just kind of push on it with a tool like my tweezers here, and then it just kind of fits down into that groove nicely. Yeah, I think that's going to work just fine. So that'll be nice. It will effectively block the mid-sentence. I just had a thought that these wires are made out of copper. Once I get all these masking wires in place, it's going to look like it's got a copper sheen to it because it's copper, and there's going to be the tops of the grooves will be clear, so it almost would achieve the same effect. So could I just leave it like that and just do wires? I suppose that's not a terrible idea. It does look a little uneven when the light catches it, just because of, this copper wire has been twisted, and so it's not perfectly smooth anymore. It's got little bumps and stuff in it. So I don't know if I'd be satisfied with that. And I guess I would want to be sure that the wires don't ever come out. I suppose a clear coat might be enough to just kind of hold those in place. I don't know. It's a thought. I guess I can see how it looks. As easy as this stuff is to get in there, it's by far the easiest masking method I've tried so far. So I'll get all the... Well, shoot, I'll just do it right now. I'll just get all those grooves masked, and we'll see how it looks. Okay, here it is with all the wires in place. Not too sure that I'm sold on the idea of just leaving the wires in place as part of the finished model, as opposed to just using them for masking. It doesn't really, it does leave a nice straight lines, but the coppery color is not very obvious. If you compare it to the painted one, copper is quite obvious on the painted one. Not so much on the, ironically, the real one. I think that's mostly because of just how shiny the wire is, where most of the light that gets reflected just, it's a specular reflection on all of this. And so either the light is directly reflecting into your eyes or it's going in a different direction that you don't see. So the color just kind of gets lost. Where with the paint, it's more of a diffuse reflection. And so you get that coppery color from many angles as opposed to just like directly on like that. I don't know if that makes sense, but one thing I could do to deal with that is put a flat coat over it, which would make it have more of a diffuse reflection. And to that end, I did put some clear coat down here on the ends of these strands. I didn't want to cover the whole thing just in case I didn't like that idea and just decided to just use it in masking. I didn't want to commit to a clear coat on that, but I did think, well, I can put some on this exposed wire down at the end and see what a difference that makes. And I don't know if it really comes across on camera, but this end down here is just the bare wire without a clear coat, where this end down here does have the clear coat. So you can see you get more of that coppery color from no matter what angle you're viewing it at. And down here you definitely get the shinier spots, but the copper color isn't as noticeable. I don't know, that could work. I do have extras of these parts. I printed 5 of them. I only need 2 for the final finished model because the warp engines just have the grill on one side only. The other side is what attaches to the pylon. And so there's only 2 I need for the finished model. So I've got one here and here, but then I've got 2 extras here just in case. Well, these 2, I guess. But then I've got 2 extras here just in case. And then the 5th one I printed because it was my first original test print. That's this one here. If you compare my first test print to the original plastic piece, my test print is basically flat and straight all the way across, but the original has a bit of curvature. Once you get towards the flared end, it starts to bend inward. And when I printed this test piece and tried to fit it into the gray plastic pieces, it really was not fitting well. And that's when I actually realized that bit of bend to it. I hadn't noticed that when I originally designed it. So I went back and updated my 3D model. It's pretty subtle, but it's there. So anyway, I've got extras. So I tested the putty method on this extra piece, but I do have 2 other extras. And if all else fails, I can print more. I just, don't want to have to go through all the printer setup if I don't have to. But I've got the extras, so you know what? I'm just going to give it a try. I'm going to spray a nice flat coat over this and see how it looks. Okay, I've got one clear coated. The one here on the left has the clear coat on it. I wanted to see how that compared to one without the clear coat, so I added the copper wire to another one here. The one on the right is just bare copper wire. And you can see the difference in reflection between the two that I was trying to explain. The specular reflections or the shininess of this bare copper wire is really quite obvious when you look at the two next to each other. But also, not only that, but if we look at them more or less straight on, without any really bright reflections coming off of them, you can see that the one on the left, the clear coated one, just has more of a reddish color to it than the one on the right. And again, that's because of the diffuse reflection that the flat coat is providing. It just lets us see more of the color of that light reflecting from different directions. So, and then the more direct reflections are much more muted, which is what you'd expect from a flat coat. Actually, not hating this idea of just using the wire on its own instead of using it as paint mask. The copper paint is providing quite a bit more color than just the wire itself. I don't know. I'll have to think about it some more before I decide one way or the other. Since I had printed 2 pairs of these warp grill pieces, I decided to go ahead and just try both methods. And so the one on the left is the one with the actual copper wire left in place, and then a matte clear coat sprayed over it. And then the one on the right, I used the wire as masking, and then I sprayed a light coat of the tester's metallic copper, and then pulled all the wires out. Still undecided on which direction I'm going to go with this. I have put in some strips of the ice blue LED lighting. I've got that wired out. It's all just temporary, but I did want to see what it looks like. So let me plug in the power here, make sure I'm not short touching anything I shouldn't. Okay, there we go. And as always, the camera is just washing out the LED lighting. I don't have the actual clear plastic pieces glued in yet. They're just set in there. And in order to keep them in place, I just stuffed in some plastic bag material, like white plastic bag. And then the LED strips are kind of just pushed on the back here. That's what you can see there is the LED strips. But the plastic bag is not really in there all that evenly. You can see there's more bright openness on this one than there is on this one. But it's enough to give me an idea of what this is going to look like. If you get up really close, you can see the light coming through the copper paint there. Like I said, I did do just kind of a light coat of the paint. I could have gone with a heavier coat. But yeah, I don't know. I'll have to decide which I like better. I guess it's a testament to how good both methods are that I'm having a hard time deciding between the two. So, on the top of the warp pylons are these features here. Not really sure what they are. Maybe auxiliary Bassard collectors. I don't know. They glow red on the model, so I want to make them glow red as well. So I'm going to have to cut that out. There is a photo etch piece in the green strawberry kit to cover that part of the model. It's right here. There's 2 of them. I've already taken one off of the thing here, but it's supposed to have kind of like an open honeycomb pattern on there, and you can see there it has some holes in it. But it's supposed to be like a honeycomb mesh, hexagonal mesh, and my part does not look like that. If we look at the instructions, right side up, that's what it's supposed to look like. But here's what mine looks like. So, yeah, I don't know, just an error in manufacturing this part. I don't know if that's a common error with this green strawberry kit, if a lot of them are like that, or if just mine's just a weird one-off freak. But either way, that's not going to work for me. So since I'm 3D printing parts for this kit anyway, I decided I can probably create something that would replace that. So I modeled that up in my 3D modeling software and came up with something like this. As you can see, I modeled some holes into it, but it doesn't actually go all the way through. And that's more down to how I printed it. Because this part is so small and it's got kind of that intricate hexagonal pattern detail, I wasn't really sure how to support this very well. I'm new to this type of 3D printing, and my supporting skills are being developed. So I wasn't quite sure how I could support this without having the supports interfere and kind of mess up that nice crisp pattern. So I decided to just print this directly on the build plate of my 3D printer. So it was, if this is my build plate, the part was just right up against it like that. And I ended up printing it about 1 millimeter thick. I modeled it 1 millimeter thick. And knowing the settings for my 3D printer, the base layers are set to a much longer exposure time to make sure that the part adheres to the build plate. So the base layers are very much overexposed compared to the remaining layers of the part, and that results in essentially just filling in those holes on the base layers. Like, it's so overexposed that the resin just keeps curing on that layer and just kind of wipes out that pattern detail. And so I knew that was going to be a possibility, so I designed it thicker than I think I would want. Like I said, I designed it for 1 millimeter thick, but and then I adjusted my transition layers so that about half of the layer, so half a millimeter, would be with the normal exposure settings, and therefore should have the hole. And then I figured I could just sand the back away until I get all the way through those base layers and the holes open up. And I'm pretty close on this one. I started sanding this one, and you can see, if I flip it around to the back, you can start to see the holes, or they're just about poking through. There's a couple of them that probably have broken open a little bit in the middle. So I'm almost there. I just need to sand just a tiny bit more off of this one, and then it'll be good to go. And I oversized it. I haven't actually fit this into the part yet to see how well it fits, but I intentionally oversized this because I wanted to make sure I didn't want there to be any gaps once I put it in here. So I know I'm probably going to have to sand off around the sides to kind of bring that down to the right dimensions to fit in here. So I'm going to have to take some material off of this thing. But about how much? A little bit. Okay, got that placed in there. Looks pretty good, I think. Got it trimmed around the edges. I had to take quite a bit off to get it to fit in there, but just took it a little bit at a time. Made sure I didn't take too much off. And then held it in place and just put a little bit of extra thin CA glue on there, and now it's holding it in place. But yeah, I like it. I think it looks good. Like I said, I don't know if the issue that I'm having with the photo etch is common or not, or if it's just kind of unique to me, but if there are other people out there who have that problem, or if there are other people who just want to do the 3D print method on this instead of the photo etch, then I'm going to make this part model available, the STL available for you to download if you want to give it a try. I'll put something down in the description, a link where you can get this STL file. I don't have any account set up on like any of the 3D print model sharing sites at the moment. I might look into setting something like that up. If I do, it'll be a link to one of those. But if not, then I'll have a link for it, make it available in some way. Also did some light blocking for the impulse engines. On the inside as well, there are going to be some red LEDs for lighting up the impulse engine in the back, and then this little grill, I don't know, auxiliary bussard collector or whatever this thing is in the front. Those light up in red, and I did the black paint for light blocking, and then the white for helping the light, as much light as possible, to get through, to get out where I want it to get out. I also did a layer of aluminum foil tape over that 3D printed part, because again, that 3D printed part lets a lot of light through. And I figured that was probably going to be the best way to just light block that. So I put some tape over it and then just repoked all the holes through with a pin, and it looks fine from the front. And then also did a layer of black light blocking on the front as well, because even with that foil tape, there was enough light getting through the holes and then kind of spreading out through the plastic. Once it got past the layer of aluminum tape, it was still kind of spreading out through that. So this does look better now that it's been light blocked on the front as well. And then on the secondary hull, I've got the two halves of it together. That is not easy to do on this model, because all you've got is just kind of this one big edge on the bottom with, I think I originally had two like little pins that would, it'd be a pin on one side and then a hole on the other, so that it would help the two pieces align. But when I removed the original phaser strip off here, that's where one of the pins was, so that got ground away. And so I only had just like one pin that was helping me align stuff. And then the only place they come together on the top is right there on that little narrow strip right there, because this whole thing here is a separate piece. And so it was a challenge to get those together, but I was able to do it. And then I went back in and added some strip styrene to reinforce that edge, just to make it nice and strong, so it'll hold together. I did that all the way back, and then I also added this piece in again just to help strengthen this secondary piece while I work on it, secondary hull piece while I work on it. And I did figure out that before I glued this in, that it is still possible to take the primary hull and kind of bring it in here and connect it together while this is already glued in place. It's a little tricky to get everything lined up properly, but it does work. It does go together like that. It'll definitely need a little bit of seam work, not too much actually, because they did put that seam on a panel line there, same as that one there and that there, so it actually shouldn't be too bad to clean that up, make it look good once it's finally in place. And I also placed in this piece here, now this is the resin aftermarket replacement for the original. There's the original there that would go there, but I got the aftermarket replacement that lets me backlight it, so it's got the clear blue resin piece that fits in. It fits in behind like that. I also drilled out these holes for the torpedo launchers so I can light those. And there's a couple of photo etch pieces that go on those just to kind of give them a little more detail. And then the blue is just some masking tape. I filled the hole with UV resin, clear UV resin, and I've taped it off to mask it. I also masked off the back here so that when I paint it I don't ruin my transparency. And once I got the two halves together, then I could start working on this seam down here. And the bulk of the remaining photo etch, which goes on the bottom here, and you can see I've done, I had to grind away the original molded in features that were here and replace those with the photo etch. There were no original molded features for those cargo bay doors, so those photo etch are great, give you that little detail there. This is the original molded in detail for that little round doohickey, sensor dome or whatever that's supposed to be. I did have to kind of clean that up a little bit just to kind of crisp up the detail. It was a little fudgy looking, kind of smoothed over and distorted looking, so I did just kind of use a knife and a scraper to clean some of that up. Still got to do a little bit of putty work on that seam to conceal it a little bit more, but I'm close on that. And then while I was working down here, I noticed there were originally some features here and back here that I think are supposed to be tractor beam emitters, and they were just, again, kind of fudgy looking. They just didn't really look that good, and so I decided to grind those off, and I modeled up in my 3D modeling software. I created a little replacement part for that. That's got some of the features that as near as I could tell on the original filming model, had a little bit more detail to it like that. So I've got one in place here. I did have to grind out a little bit of a recess for that to fit into, and I've done that on the back here, but I haven't placed the 3D printed part in yet on that side. There's a little 3D printed part that fits in there. So I think this is getting pretty close to needing a coat of primer, and for the black and white light handling coats of paint on the inside. The one drawback that I found of assembling all this like I have is that it's going to be a little more difficult to do the light handling paint inside of here. So I might have to maybe use an airbrush to try and get it down in there rather than a spray can. I just worry if I try to get a spray can in there, I'm going to just end up getting gobs of paint on the outside here. I think I might actually mask off the outside just so I don't, because the paint I use for the inside is just cheap Rust-Oleum stuff that goes on really thick, really heavy, and which is fine for the inside, but I don't want it filling in my details on the outside, so I think I will mask that off. I've got most of my lighting planned out, so I'm starting to get some of it installed here, but this video has gotten pretty long, so I'm going to call it there for this one. We'll go over lighting in the next one. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I hope you'll join me on the next one.